Indigenous mental health and the suicide epidemic. If you were following the news in April of last year, you may have heard about the small Ontario nation of Attawapiskat. Attawapiskat made the news because Chief Bruce Shishin declared a state of emergency because of the fact that 11 youth attempted to commit suicide all in one night. But it's not just Attawapiskat. Indigenous youth suicides are at an epidemic proportion. Indigenous community suicide rates are 5 to 7 times that of non-Indigenous populations, and suicide and self-inflicted injuries are the leading cause of death for First Nations and Indigenous peoples below the age of 44. The sensational media attention on the epidemic focused on the poverty and despair of the community and painted the epidemic as inherent to the reserve, making it seem like an Indigenous issue and thereby furthering a colonial agenda. In an attempt to shift the blame from Indigenous people, historical and intergenerational trauma are sourced as a cause for the suicide epidemic. While the effects of initial contact with the settlers, ensuing acts of colonization, stealing of land, residential schools, and various other historical atrocities are a factor in today's current mental health climate, trauma is not just historical, but continues to be perpetuated today. In reality, it is hard to imagine having positive mental health in circumstances where you have lack of adequate housing, poor water quality, lack of education, destruction of land, and many other oppressive issues going on. The emphasis on historical trauma pathologizes Indigenous family structures in their transfer of knowledge and child rearing and ignores the ongoing effects of settler colonialism. In the earlier example of Attawapiskat, the federal government flew in crisis workers, a needed but reactive measure. Rather, they need to engage in restorative justice attempts to repair harms done to people and social relationships through their wrongdoings. Restorative justice is based off of Indigenous conceptions of justice and is restoration of balance and harmony like that represented by the medicine wheel. Restorative justice is meant to heal those damaged relationships and ensure that everyone involved, especially the victims, is treated with concern, respect, and dignity. Restorative justice begins by acknowledging the harm done, taking ownership of the poor conditions of Indigenous communities, and funneling greater funding into Indigenous communities just as has been done in the rest of rural and urban Canada. Only by starting towards this journey and addressing the physical needs of the community can the Indigenous population truly begin to focus on the mental health of their people. A protective influence in regards to mental health that was identified in many studies was the presence of cultural identity and cultural continuity. Cultural continuity can be looked at as a passing down of culture from generation to generation as a tool for growth, learning, identity, as well as a link to your past, family, community, and many other aspects of societal and individual life. Also, the Euro-American model of a person is considered individualistic. However, the many Indigenous peoples are characterized as ecocentric, connected to the land and animals, cosmocentric, connected to ancestral lineage or the spiritual world, and communalistic, emphasis is placed on family, kin, and clan. The current use of government interventions in Indigenous communities through biomedical healthcare systems and ignoring the need for culturally sensitive restorative justice is just a contemporary realization of settler colonialism, a forced push for Western ontology, whereas communities require culturally representative initiative. Therefore, a completely Western approach to Indigenous health and well-being simply does not fit, and a culturally appropriate model depending on the needs of specific communities has to be developed. Indigenous communities around Canada have already begun the work of combating mental health issues by capitalizing on the protective factors of cultural continuity. Examples such as the reclamation of language through immersion schools, the rise of Indigenous hip-hop and other music,
told myself that enough's enough.
And rites of passage ceremonies such as Ohalogo, which began in Akwesasne and then was brought over to Six Nations 4 years ago.
In a 4-year adolescent rites of passage ceremony that challenges them spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and physically.
We have to use measures that integrate tradition, culture, spirituality, and also take into account the physical barriers that may be present so that we have a holistic picture and way of healing. One such method developed by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marcia is two-eyed seeing, which is learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of Western knowledges and ways of knowing, and using both eyes together for the benefit of all. Through two-eyed seeing and principles of restorative justice, Indigenous communities can lead the road to better mental health using approaches that fit within the cultures and traditions of specific communities while taking advantage of Western approaches as well. It is clear, however, that until the issues of ongoing colonialism and oppression are addressed, the road to holistically healthy Indigenous communities will be a difficult but not impossible one.